our topic yesterday dove towards balance of life because it's all entrepreneurs and the difference between someone that watches the clock to punch out, to shut off and go home every day of the week. And on Friday, that clock is that much more valuable. But for a lot of leaders, for a lot of entrepreneurs, that clock doesn't mean a darn thing. So when you're visiting with people, executives and whatnot, what are you trying to do to get them to understand that if they don't have rewards, they're always just doing the grind. And when you're doing the grind, you're much less successful.
I love that you phrased it that way about doing the grind, because I'm going to start off by saying I don't believe in balance. I believe in harmony. Because when you try to get people to look at it in terms of I have to balance all of this, they look at it as a zero-sum game. Like I have to get rid of something in order to have balance. And so for leaders, having them look at it as harmony actually helps them a little bit more.
I was watching a commencement speech and I just happened to come upon it on YouTube, and it was Elon Musk.
Mm.
He and his partners in the company at the time they had an office space but didn't have an apartment. They just slept in the office. And he said, I put in 100 hours. And, someone who puts in 100 hours is going to get more done than somebody who puts in 50 hours. So now, are these unattainable goals? Does that set the wrong standard?
He is a driven person, and there's nothing wrong with being driven. And obviously his drive has led him to the success that he has, but he's paid some dear price for that. If you look at his life, he has to admit he's had severe burnout, and that he has struggled with depression, and he's struggled with a lot of things in his life because of his drive. And no one's saying that you shouldn't be driven. Like, it's not an excuse to go, well, I'm not going to put in the time or the hours. But it's also a recognition of, we're a machine. Our bodies are machines, and we can only take them so far. And if we don't take care of ourselves, our mind and our bodies, they will break down on us. That's just the reality of life. When we talk to people about, when they're on their deathbed and they talk about what they missed in life, no one ever says, I wish I had worked more hours.
Let's talk about when you have new tasks, whether it be a pivot, whether it be an existing position, when you have XYZ that needs to be done, a new challenge, if you will. And let's go back to that automobile. You could be a fast running gas guzzler that takes about 15 minutes to refuel, or you could be that electric car that takes a few hours to refuel. So as we're driven, how important is it for us to plan to recharge our internal batteries so that we can continue up that road of success or up that trajectory?
Well, I think you answered the question in the question right there. I mean, it really is about knowing what type of car you are. If it only takes me, 5 to 15 minutes to refuel, then I need to recognize that and I need to plan for it. But if it takes me 5 or 10 hours, I also need to plan for that. So my favorite uncle, my dad used to always get mad at him because he would go to bed at 6 o'clock at night. And they would always have this argument about, why are you going to bed so early? But my uncle recognized, he was an engineer by profession, but he always recognized that he needed a longer charge time than most people. And so they would always have this argument around New Year's Eve. So at midnight, because my dad was like a night owl, but also an early riser, he didn't need a lot of refuel time. And so at midnight, he'd call my uncle to wish him a happy new year, and it would go to voicemail, and then he'd be really mad that it went to voicemail. He's like, you couldn't even stay up for the new year. And my uncle's running joke was the year was going to happen with or without me, so I might as well make sure that I'm ready for it in the morning.
How do leaders recognize that burnout could be occurring? I mean, obviously, when it gets to an extreme place, yes, but ideally, as we all know, we want to try to be preemptive without being too in control or overbearing. How much of that responsibility for not getting burnt out does fall on leadership, and how much of it falls on just simply the employee and the management themselves?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer that question with a story. So one of the very first leaders that I had, I think I was like 23 years old. This was my first job out of college. Was a gentleman named Doug, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he was a sniper in Vietnam. So that really gives you like the context of how old the story is in terms of, and so he was really interesting because one of the things that he taught, and he taught me a lot of the things that I still use today in leadership, but one of the things that he taught us is that when we sat down to do a project, and he, as the leader, would just really give us the direction, and it was our responsibility to figure out the how of the project. One of the things that he did in that is that he also included, I also need you to figure out how you're going to re-energize yourself. Now, as a leader, that's really unique and interesting because a lot of leaders don't even think about that. They sort of figure out, well, I've told people what they need to do, and they need to figure out how they're going to take care of all of it. But he made a point of saying, not in a dictatorial fashion, not in a micromanaging fashion, he made a point of saying, you have to also figure out the rejuvenation process. And it was funny because that was the first time I had heard that, at 23. And I was thinking, at 23, your rejuvenation process doesn't even exist. You're like the Energizer Bunny. You go on forever. And so I sort of looked at him like, what does that mean? And, he saw the look on my face, as the new kid on the block, and then with the confusion. And he said, let me explain. When you're working on something, and especially if it's a deadline project, and we're going to be putting a lot of hours into this project, you also have to consider, how do you make sure you don't get burned out and that you can continue to show up and give your best? Because you can't give your best if you have nothing to give.
The story you just told, which is one where you're really, you're giving someone advice and consideration on how they should be treating themselves. And so often we think of empathy, or maybe one of the definitions or one of the examples of empathy is, how can I feel for you? How can I do what's right for you? He actually took it to another level.
Yeah.
Your boss, which was, how can you do for you?
Right.
And that consideration is an enormous chapter in the empathy book.